A James House by Jenna Eady. Growing up, I've always been interested in gender and what I thought was the differences between them. Beginning to break down those gender barriers at age 2, here I am wearing my dad's sunglasses. At school, I was friends with boys and girls, and it was not until I was 11 years old that I even really noticed the difference. In year 6, everything changed. School became a place of segregated activity for some classes. Sexual education became two-sided, boys to learn about boys and girls to learn about girls. At the time it seemed understandable. Boys would not have periods and girls would, so why would they need to learn about it? Statistically, it is possible to infer that our personal and sexual education is flawed. Not to say that it is entirely bad, but there are definite criticisms to be made. There are varying possibilities as to why, as each school and teacher is different. But evidence that I've gathered indicates to a lack of government guidance, the most recent update appearing after 20 years. When I began secondary school in 2010, physical education became boys' classes and girls' classes. We would play netball and hockey, they would play football and rugby. Physical contact sports were not encouraged for girls. Outside of school, my friends were male and female, heading to play games at the local park most evenings. Red letter was a favourite amongst the group, the aim of which meant finding and beating up the opposing team members until they gave up the letter and you could spell the word to win. We were not bothered about physical contact then, and the gender difference did not matter. At GCSE level, there was a top boys group and a top girls group for maths and science subjects, supposedly done to eliminate all distractions and to see whether males or females tested better. Ultimately, this was not a fair test, as it discreetly implied anyone below the said top range wasn't worth eliminating the gender distractions for. Continuing through education, the separation seemed less, and we were finally back to mixed sexual education groups at the age of 15. But at a time when we were pushed back together to learn about each other's bodies, in maths and science we were separated from learning about each other's minds. I have always had a fascination into gender, the stereotypes, the inequality, and the feminist movements that got us to where we are today. Throughout this final year at university, I have been pushed to explore what gender performance is and means. So throughout this presentation, I want to explain my work, the research behind it, and what I have found in the significance of it. Beginning with a visual of my final project work for realization, so you can later see what I am referring to. Performance. Beginning with Vision in September, I was interested in exploring gender themes and constructs, but was uncertain on how to proceed. My first artist inspiration was Gemma Marmalade. Marmalade was undertaking research for her PhD, which included constructing and performing as Professor Dallaire throughout the last year of university, inspiring me to construct James, who then became the focus point of this project. Through my research as James, I have realised that gender roles, the performance and masquerade of them, impacts every aspect of our daily lives whilst living in a patriarchal Western society. Here's some footage of James and Professor Dallaire from a tutorial last October.
You to explore.
Yeah.
And I think what is especially fascinating is your suggestion of a difficulty or an additional nuance to these feminine gestures for you to behave. There's a wonderful inversion between those things, so I think that is particularly useful to you. I think these are fantastic. I think you can explore how you use the studio,
Yeah.
whether, like you say, you use props in this process. So tell me more about your research over the last couple of weeks. I understand you have been engaging in more active and live engagement with the wider world, with
Yes.
society.
Yes, I did join the course last week for the symposium, the digital light painting one. It was
Okay.
a brilliant day. Very broad research that I've never even come across, but it was very nice to meet everyone on the course. It was really interesting. Everyone was very friendly, and we've got some lovely students on this course. It was
Influenced by Adrian Piper, I wanted to attempt public performance to measure an audience's reaction, but venturing around Derby city centre, publicly I struggled to perform. Some members of the public shouted sarcastic comments towards me, and I was not ready for the criticism so early in the project. Thinking of more productive ways to create work, I found artists Claude Cahoon and Catherine Opie. Specifically, Opie's series Being and Having was key to my own practice and the way James was aesthetically created. Her series Domestic made me look closer to home and was important research further along the project. Gender as performance. During this time, I read texts from philosopher Judith Butler, and I became fascinated in the role that my parents, family, and home life played in my own gender construction. Butler's gender theory argues against the idea of gender as innate. In an interview with Big Think, Butler describes an overview of what her research has informed her about gender. We act as if that of being a man or that of being a woman is actually an internal reality or something that is simply true about us, a fact about us, but it's a phenomenon that's produced and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Butler's claim about how gender is created is that gender is traditionally learnt by children, usually taught by gender binary, meaning one male and one female parent, a series of societally structured gendered norms. The parents produce the examples of how men and women typically should behave, the way they dress, act, and their role in patriarchal society. This is then reproduced by children. However, Butler claims that factually there is no reason to believe that one person is one gender and one person is another. Instead, it is a persona and outward cosmetic factors we present to the world that creates it. Her use of the word phenomenon is significant. Phenomenon describes a fact or situation that is observed to exist or happen, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question. By this she means gender constructs can be questioned, the purpose of them factually unknown. Butler describes how this phenomenon happens. Non-purposefully, parents will pass on these roles to their children and therefore teaching them the anxiety of not being feminine or masculine enough, exaggerating their gender masquerades to avoid becoming a social threat. My project was then brought into the family setting, and I became intrigued with the impact that our social conditioning had on our gender representations and how we learnt this through our parents. Researching further into texts from the likes of Joan Riviere, Jennifer Blessing, and Paul Jobling, most texts agreed upon the basis that gender is a performance taught to us by our parental figures. For example, the feminine masquerade of a female-born subject may involve conformity to social expectation, while for the same person, a butch presentation may yield a forced self-conscious in certain contexts because of a socially perceived enunciation of difference, which is drag. Hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity in a heterosexual situation may be perceived as essentially equivalent to the respective male and female subjects, while cross-dressing is more easily read as purpose or artificial performance. The hyperbolic representation of gender seems conformist when sex and gender presentation correspond, and oppositional when they differ. Societal ideologies are constantly at work, and our social conditioning has a huge impact on our perception of ourselves. Blessing suggests if someone wants to be perceived undoubtedly as a female, it is possible they will adopt a set of hyper-feminine social signifiers, such as the use of feminine clothing, wearing makeup, certain mannerisms and characteristics which would appear much softer than the microaggressions often acted out by males. Furthermore, when rhetorically asking which is drag, she alludes to the reader that all gender and the performance of it is a masquerade, whether it be conforming or non-conforming, suggesting people will adopt a set of social signifiers which confirm to others whether they are a man or a woman, and the lack of confirming signifiers is when traditional views are challenged. However, no matter the gender portrayal, everyone will unconsciously perform their preferred gender representation because socially we are trained to do so. Patriarchy and masculinity. Patriarchy and masculinity are two major themes in my work, detailed in Costuming of James and the stereotypes builders brew in a huge Sports Direct mug. The Sports Direct mug is a British stereotype of builders or construction workers. It represents the highly masculine role of the builder. Everything they do is very manly, they're very hard-working and therefore so dehydrated that they need a mug triple the size of your average one. It is a device that I have used in my work to stress the hyper-masculine role. The beards, wigs and sunglasses used have all been key to James's performance since the beginning, creating that machismo attitude. The consumption of machismo cinema was essential to this work, initially using Die Hard and now moving on to Triple X. For me, I wanted to explore the details of masculinity and what makes it so strict, but to do this, the work and intentions behind it had to be playful, as I wanted to subvert the usual constructs around these themes. Triple X is a machismo film in overdrive. Vin Diesel is depicted as a heroic outlaw sent to take down a criminal operation in Russia, eventually saving the world and getting the girl. The violent audio is contrasted by my 2 hours of slow and barely moving imagery. Triple X showing an unrealistic portrayal of masculinity, but one which we commonly consume. The title was created to fit the main character's name, Xander Cage, but has many other connotations, the main ones being X-rated for extreme violence or sexuality, including connotations of pornography, which is not known for its gender equality and is often derogatory towards women. The film and its production are consistent in these obnoxious themes, including a $10,000 a minute helicopter that was used to film an explosive escape scene. My intention for my degree show was to have 9 families, varying in race, age, gender and religion, portray James, representing their lives living under patriarchy. No matter their lifestyle or situation, everyone is someone impacted by masculinity. The image of the lazy Sunday afternoon film is one I feel is a commonality between families within our society. Even within this activity, there can be impacts of gender stereotypes. I wanted to show a variation in family types because it's important to realize that even outside of the stereotypical nuclear family, whether it be a group of friends, a work environment, a university setting, but they all create and conform to a tacit family constructs under patriarchy, even if it is unintentional. The home. A prime example of these alternative family constructs appeared in the 18th and 19th century. The Molly House was a meeting place for homosexual men, often led and owned by a transgender mother figure. At the time, homosexual relations were illegal and remained a capital offence until 1861. Molly houses created communities and safe spaces for homosexual men. They displayed sexual connotations and provided a place for homosexual sexual activities, a home and safe place for homosexuality. However, they became the target for a lot of crime. Raids and arrests were often made, the most famous of which would be the raid on Mother Clapp's Molly House. 3 of her customers were hanged for sodomy. She and half a dozen of her customers were fined and imprisoned for up to 2 years. Molly houses also became the ideal target for blackmailers. Cross-dressing and what we would refer to as drag in contemporary society was encouraged. Other family and female-related activities took place, such as wedding ceremonies and mock births were performed. Contextually, this was a time in England with increasing importance on family values. The household was used as a fundamental place for reproduction and subsistence. Men worked and provided, women produced children and lived as a mother. There was no place in the law for homosexuals. The Molly House represents the impact of patriarchal rule and the use of a family structure even in situations where it's not necessary. Men becoming female mother figures, creating wedding ceremonies and birth performances represents how ingrained family culture was and is in Britain today. These communities of homosexual men conformed to the female roles of a typical family, but did so in secrecy because any act where men seemed to be passive or weak, they would be marginalized and prosecuted for doing so. But the concept of the family as a safe space, a place for relations to be built, is deeply rooted in the form of Molly houses. Even in these unexpected places, the concept of family is so important in its influence. Per my previous point of how parents and their roles teach their children, whether biological or not, about their own culture and person by producing and reproducing examples of the correct gender forms, it is still important to recognize how ingrained family roles are as a socially accepted norm, and even in non-typical ways they are used to influence our children in their gender roles or exploration. By working in my project, A James House, my intention is to show the impact of patriarchy and its ideas about family constructs, and how they apply to anyone no matter the situation or circumstance. I can do this freely now, but contextually I think it's important to note how this was not always a given freedom. Doing further research, I read Sacred Cows by Rosalind Coward. In this, I came across The Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, and it changed my perspective on the importance of the home setting. My intentions for the 9 videos were for them to be recorded in 9 different families' houses. It seemed to be the best way to show a family diversity and the impact patriarchy had on regular people's lives. But when watching A Doll's House, I realised the importance of this setting, as historically the domestic home was a place of patriarchal oppression. When feminism attacked the patriarchy, it was attacking the whole package of men's power: economic, legal, sexual and emotional. Even though Ibsen's version of The Doll House had been written 100 years previously, most feminists, it pretty well summed up the inevitable female subordination in patriarchal family. In 1879, the first performance of A Doll's House was in Copenhagen. The 3-act play pivoted around the central female character of Nora Helmer and her position as a vulnerable housewife. Her husband disowns her after finding out she had illegally borrowed money from one of his co-workers at a bank to pay for his expensive medical care. Miraculously, she's forgiven when the evidence of these transactions is returned to the couple. However, hurt and frustrated by her husband's treatment of her, she decides to leave the family, an unprecedented action at the time. There was much backlash to the play, and this attitude towards the play was replicated in real life, women performing the subservient role as mother and housewife. Fourth wave feminism and my work in contemporary society. Almost 100 years after A Doll's House was written, in the 1980s and 90s, there was third wave feminist revolution across the Western world. Gender equality was slowly progressing. Some of it was achieved in response to feminist demands, and some of it was in need of a new economy. Women were no longer in a doll's house. They had become working women with careers and families. Their rights were no longer socially shunned. A key example of this progression, women had been able to divorce their husbands since 1923, but only on the grounds of adultery. In 1937, following the war, the grounds were increased to that of the men's: cruelty, desertion, and incurable insanity. But the Divorce Reform Act in 1969 was the turning point. These liberalizations of divorce law, combined with the changing attitude and expectations of marriage and the greater economic independence of women, all contributed to a rise in the number of divorces from 50,000 per year in 1971 to 150,000 a decade later. Today, during the fourth wave of feminism, there is still inequality in social issues like these. My work is concerned with proving that there should be equality for all genders in all aspects of our society. My work intends to be a statement that gender is performative. It can be altered and changed, and there is a whole spectrum in between the male and female representation of gender. Additionally, the use of the house and the family constructs is essential to my work. Within different family dynamics, there are members of groups who naturally assume a more parental role than others. These members still have the responsibility to care for and teach those who assume a child role. My intention is to show the roles of parents do not necessarily have to be a mother, father, and then their children. They can be shown through various gender figures in various family dynamics. Contextually, I think work and art such as my own is important in contemporary times. The fight of feminism has changed. 100 years ago, I would have wanted the right to vote and work, but now I want total equality for people of all genders. My work is an avenue to show people how easy it should be to change and construct, deconstruct, make ambiguous or obvious their gender identity, and at the same time should not be ashamed or oppressed for doing so. I recognize it would be simple to compartmentalize myself as a young, straight, white female. They are possibly my most recognizable characteristics in a strictly patriarchal sense. But crucially, when creating this work, I recognize the privilege that comes along with being all those things. Gender and its roles should be fluid and accepted in any form it takes place, and this is the underlying reason as to why I have produced this work. Myself and my work understands the privileges I have and attempts to make use of them as an ally to those who do not.